The bulldozer arrived at 10 in the morning, right on schedule, the way that ruin always seems to arrive punctual, indifferent, dressed in the ordinary clothes of a Tuesday. Eleanor Hargrove heard it before she saw it. The low diesel growl carried across the flat spring fields like a verdict being read aloud, and she sat in her rocking chair on the porch and listened to it come. She did not stand. She did not reach for the shotgun leaning against the doorframe. She simply set the wooden box of photographs on her lap, the one she had carried out with her that morning before the sun was fully up, and she waited. The box held 41 years of her life with Frank. Preston Calloway stepped out of his black Mercedes before the engine had fully stopped. The way men who are accustomed to being obeyed always move, as if the world is already arranged to receive them. He wore a charcoal suit that had never known a hard day's work. His shoes were the color of wet river stones polished to a shine that had no business being on a Montana farm. He looked at Eleanor the way a contractor looks at a wall he has already decided to knock down. Behind his car came the flatbed with the bulldozer, and behind that, two white pickup trucks carrying men in sunglasses who were pretending to be something more legitimate than what they were. Sheriff Dale Hutchins pulled in last. He sat in his cruiser for a long moment before opening the door, and Eleanor noticed that and filed it away. A man who hesitates before doing a thing that troubles him still has something worth reaching. Calloway climbed the porch steps without being invited. He held a manila envelope thick with papers, and he set it on the railing beside her rocking chair with the careful deliberateness of someone making a point. Eleanor did not look at it. She looked at him. His smile was the kind that costs nothing and means nothing, the kind that has been practiced in mirrors. He began to speak something about legal orders and bank transfers, and the date, always the date, April 15th, as if repeating it enough times would make her feel the weight of it, the way he wanted her to feel it. Eleanor let him talk. She had found in 80 years that men like Preston Calloway needed to hear themselves speak. It was the only way they knew they existed. She was not afraid of him. She had held the hands of dying men in cold rooms. She had watched Frank breathe his last in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and lost time. She had buried a husband and kept a farm running alone through a Montana winter, and she had done all of it without asking a single person for help. Fear was a thing she had run out of long ago. The cheap phone on the arm of her rocking chair rang. It was not her regular phone. That was inside on the kitchen table. This one was a prepaid thing, the kind sold in gas stations, with a cracked plastic shell and a single number stored in its memory. It had sat on the arm of that rocking chair for 3 months without making a sound. Eleanor picked it up. She listened. One sentence came through the speaker, low and steady as a rock. She set the phone back down. She looked out at the eastern horizon, at the flat line where her wheat fields met the sky. Then she looked at Preston Calloway, and for the first time that morning, she smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the smile of a woman who has just been told that everything she needed was already on its way. Calloway's expression shifted slightly. Something behind his eyes recalculated. Eleanor said nothing. She just listened to the ground begin to tremble. But that is the end of the story. To understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to January and the storm that changed everything, and the night Eleanor Hargrove walked out into a blizzard that should have killed her to drag 19 strangers back from the edge of dying. You have to go back to the night she chose to be Frank's kind of person, even when Frank was no longer there to see it. The winters in that part of Montana have a particular character. They are not dramatic in the way that people who have never lived through one imagine. There is no single catastrophic moment, no grand theatrical assault. The cold arrives incrementally and then all at once, and the land simply accepts it, the way the land accepts everything, without complaint, without appeal, without any indication that it intends to yield. Eleanor had lived on the Hargrove farm for 41 years, long enough to know the specific grammar of each season. She knew the way the light changed in the week before a hard freeze, turning thinner and more distant, as if the sun were already beginning its retreat. She knew the particular silence that settled over the fields on the night before a serious storm, the animals going quiet, the wind dropping to nothing, the whole landscape holding its breath. She had known the blizzard was coming 2 days before it arrived. She had laid in extra firewood, checked the roof, made sure the generator had fuel. She had done all the things that needed doing, which was what Eleanor Hargrove had always done quietly, without fuss, without waiting for anyone to tell her what was necessary. 30 years as a county nurse had trained her to see problems before they arrived and to prepare for them without drama. Frank used to say she was the most practical woman he had ever met. He said it as a compliment. Eleanor had always taken it as one. Frank Hargrove had been gone for 18 months. The stroke had come without warning, which was the only mercy in it. He had been in the barn working on the old tractor the way he spent most Saturday mornings, and when Eleanor went out to call him in for lunch, she had found him on the floor beside the rear wheel, his face calm, his eyes already looking at something she could not see. The emergency services had come in 23 minutes. The paramedics had worked on him in the yard, right there in the dirt he had farmed for 40 years, and Eleanor had stood at the edge of the action and watched with the trained steadiness of a woman who had seen too much death to pretend that the body's protests could change its outcome. He had not regained consciousness. She had held his hand for the 4 hours it took, and then she had let go, and then she had gone home to the farm and fed the animals, and made herself a bowl of soup, and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee mug still in its place on the other side of the table. And she had allowed herself exactly 1 hour of grief before she stood up and began the work of going on. That was Eleanor's way. It had always been Eleanor's way. The medical bills had started arriving within a week of the funeral. They came in waves, each envelope a new variation on the same theme, each one adding another layer to a total that grew past the point of reason and kept growing. The ambulance, the emergency room, the specialist who had been called in from Billings, the ICU hours, the medications administered in those last 4 hours when the outcome was already written, and the only question was the timing. Eleanor had gone through every bill with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She had questioned charges that seemed wrong, written letters, made phone calls. But the bills from Redemption County Medical Center, which bore the name Callaway on its new wings, she would later understand, though she did not understand it then, were simply what they were: large, legitimate on their face, and utterly beyond what a working farm could absorb without selling the things that made it a farm at all. She had sold the cattle first because that was the largest asset and the most liquid, then the newer equipment, then the second truck. She had refinanced once and then again through First Territorial Bank, which had been accommodating in the way that lenders are accommodating when they can see the shape of what is coming. By January, the foreclosure proceedings were 3 months along. The date had been set, April 15th. Eleanor knew the number. She knew what it meant. She had made her peace with it in the systematic way she made her peace with most things, by acknowledging it clearly, by feeling it fully for exactly as long as she allowed herself to feel it, and then by continuing to get up every morning and tend the land that was for the time being still hers. She had not told anyone how close to the edge she was. There was no one to tell. The children she and Frank had tried to have, had wanted to have, had grieved the absence of across 4 decades they did not exist. The friends from her nursing years had scattered or passed. The town of Redemption, 12 miles down the county road, knew her face and her name and very little else. She was the Hargrove widow. She was the woman who ran the farm alone. She was in the way of rural communities that admire self-sufficiency without inquiring too closely into its costs, doing just fine. She was doing no such thing. But Eleanor Hargrove did not ask for help. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was something deeper than stubbornness. It was a conviction formed over 8 decades of living that the way you showed respect for the people around you was by carrying your own weight, by not burdening them with your difficulties, by being the person who helped, not the person who needed helping. Frank had shared this conviction. It was one of the things that had made them as a pair something solid and self-contained and complete. They had needed very little from the world outside the boundaries of their farm. They had needed each other and the land and the rhythm of seasons, and that had been enough. Without Frank, the self-containment had become a kind of loneliness so familiar that Eleanor had stopped recognizing it as loneliness. It was simply the weather of her days. She moved through it. She endured it. She did not complain about it because complaining required an audience, and she had none. This was how she was living when January arrived, and with it the storm. It came on a Wednesday night, earlier and harder than even her careful reading of the signs had suggested. By 8 in the evening, the wind was serious. By 9, it had moved past serious into something that had a different quality entirely. Not just cold and fast, but purposeful, as if it had somewhere specific to be and intended to get there by moving through whatever stood in its way. The snow was not falling so much as it was being flung horizontal and dense, turning the beam of the porch light into a wall of white static. Eleanor had already brought in extra wood. She had the generator running. She had fed the animals before dark, knowing she would not be going back to the barn until morning. She made herself tea and sat with it at the kitchen table, listening to the storm work itself up to its full height. And she thought about Frank the way she thought about him most evenings, not with acute grief anymore, but with the low, continuous ache of absence, the way a healed brake still registers cold weather. She heard the engines at 9:40. At first, she thought she was mistaken. The wind had a way of producing sounds that were not there, assembling them from its own noise into approximations of familiar things. But the sound persisted and grew, and it had a mechanical regularity that wind could not replicate multiple engines. She realized not one working hard against conditions that had no business containing them. Motorcycles. The thought was so improbable that she sat with it for a moment before moving. Then she went to the window that faced the driveway and pressed her face close to the glass, shielding her eyes from the light behind her. Through the white chaos, she could see headlights. A dozen, maybe more, weaving down the long drive that led from the county road to the farmyard. Even as she watched, the lights began going out, not switching off, but toppling one after another like candles being snuffed. She heard the crashes even through the walls, metal on frozen earth, and then faintly voices, men shouting, then the voices cutting off, swallowed by the wind. Eleanor stood at the window for the span of 3 full breaths. She knew what rode in groups like that. Everyone in Redemption County knew about Hell's Iron. They had been a presence in this part of Montana for 15 years, visible at the truck stop off the highway, talked about in the particular low voice that people use for things they are afraid of and not entirely sure they understand. Outlaws, dangerous men, the kind of people that decent folk were advised to give a wide berth. Whatever they were dying in her driveway. She thought of Frank. She thought of the thing he had said more times than she could count. Said it in the same even tone, whether it applied to a neighbor's broken down truck, or a stranger at the side of the road, or the injured hawk they had nursed back to health one spring in a cardboard box in the kitchen. You don't get to choose who deserves help, Ellie. You just choose whether to help. She put on her coat, the heavy one, the one with the worn cuffs. She laced her boots. She took the emergency lantern from the hook by the back door and checked that it was charged. She wrapped a scarf twice around her neck and pulled her wool hat down over her ears. Then she opened the back door and the storm came in to meet her like something that had been waiting. The cold was beyond anything the word cold was meant to describe. It was not a temperature. It was a presence, physical and aggressive, finding every seam of her clothing in the first second and pressing through it. Her lungs seized on the first breath, the air so cold it felt solid, and she stood in the doorway for one moment only, and let her body register what it was walking into. Then she walked into it. She found the guide rope her father-in-law had strung between the house and the barn back in 1961, a simple precaution that had saved lives in bad winters, and that Frank had maintained every year without being asked. She wrapped her fingers around it and moved hand over hand into the white. She nearly stepped on the first man before the lantern found him. He was enormous, easily the largest human being she had seen outside of a hospital, and he lay face down in the snow with his motorcycle half on top of him. She knelt beside him, pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was there, slow and thready, but present. His skin was the color of old wax. Eleanor assessed him the way she had assessed 1,000 patients in 30 years of nursing, quickly, without sentiment, cataloging what was known and what was needed. Hypothermia advanced. Possible head injury. Structural damage indeterminate. He needed warmth. He needed it in the next 15 minutes in a serious way, and the barn was 80 yards away across terrain that the storm had turned into something close to impassable. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He did not move. He was, she would later learn, 260 pounds, of a man named Thomas Mahoney, who rode under the name Brick for reasons that had to do with both his dimensions and his temperament. She had pulled unconscious patients before in emergencies when no one else was available. She had never pulled one like this. She reset her grip, dug her heels into the frozen earth, leaned back with everything she had, and pulled again. He moved 2 inches, then another, then a foot. The wind pushed against her as if it understood what she was doing and objected. The snow found the gap between her scarf and her collar. Her fingers, even through her heaviest gloves, registered the cold as a kind of pain that moved past sensation into something that felt like it was being done to the bone rather than the skin. She pulled. She counted steps because counting gave the mind something to do while the body did the impossible. She told herself 10 more pulls and then 10 more after that, and she did not allow herself to look up and see how far the barn still was. It took 20 minutes to get him through the barn door. She covered him with horse blankets, checked his pulse again, and went back out. The second man was 20 yards from the first. Shorter but solid, wearing a vest covered in patches that Eleanor registered without reading her attention. On the medical facts, his lips were blue. His fingers curled in the specific way that meant the muscles had started to go. His breathing was shallow but regular. She pulled him in. She went back out. She did this 19 times. The storm did not ease. The cold did not relent. Each trip back into the white was harder than the last because her body was accumulating a debt of exertion that it would eventually call due, and she could feel the interest building with each return to the open air. Her lower back, which had given her trouble for a decade, began sending signals of escalating urgency that she filed and ignored. Her knees, which were not what they had been, registered each uneven step through the drifts. She pulled anyway. The last man was at the far end of the driveway, closest to the county road, which meant he was the farthest from the barn, which meant he was the hardest to reach and the most exposed, and had been in the storm the longest. His motorcycle lay across his legs, which told her immediately that the leg beneath it was wrong, bent at an angle that legs were not designed to achieve. She moved the bike with a combination of leverage and desperation that she would not have thought herself capable of on a better day, and she checked his pulse and found it slower than she would have liked, and she looked at his face. He was older than the others, 50-something with a gray beard and a face that even unconscious carried a quality of contained authority, the kind of face that had given orders for a long time and had the lines to prove it. His jacket had additional patches that she would later understand indicated rank. The name on his cut said Grim. She grabbed him under the arms. She pulled. After 10 yards, she stopped because her legs would not continue, and she needed to acknowledge that before they simply stopped without her permission. She sat down in the snow beside him in the howling white, and she breathed. Her lungs burned. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel with Raymond Coles at the center of it, in the barn door at the far end. Her heart was doing things at its age that it probably should not do, and she was aware of that too, the way a pilot is aware of a warning light, noting it, assessing it, deciding to continue anyway. She thought of Frank. She thought of the way he had looked the last time she had seen him conscious, which was the morning of the day he died over breakfast, when he had looked up from his coffee and smiled at her for no reason except that she was there, and he was glad she was. 41 years of that. 41 years of being someone's reason for a smile before the coffee was finished. She was not going to die in this driveway. Not tonight. Not like this. She pulled Raymond Coles the remaining 70 yards to the barn door in 4 separate efforts, stopping twice more to breathe, and she got him inside and covered him and checked his broken leg by feel and found that it was a clean break, which was the best possible version of a bad thing. And she propped his leg on a hay bale and covered him and lit the kerosene heater that Frank had installed in the center of the barn 15 years ago for exactly the kind of night that night was. Then she sat down on a hay bale with her shotgun across her lap, and she shook for several minutes without being able to stop it. And then the shaking stopped, and she set up the camping stove she had carried out with the second load of supplies, and she began to make soup. The first to wake was Brick. His eyes came open fast, the way eyes open when the body has been trained to return to readiness rather than ease, and his hand went immediately to his belt, finding nothing, and he sat up too quickly and winced. "Easy," Eleanor said from her hay bale without looking up from the pot. "You've got hypothermia and likely a concussion. Sit up slowly or you'll be sick." He found her with his eyes. He looked at the shotgun on her lap. He looked at the barn, at the other shapes laid out under horse blankets, at the kerosene heater glowing orange in the center of the space. He looked at her. "Where am I?" he said. "My barn," she said, "about 12 miles outside of Redemption. You and 18 of your people were dying in my driveway. I brought you in." Brick stared at her. "You did that by yourself." "It needed doing." He looked at his own hands, at the blankets piled on top of him, at the improvised arrangement of her barn turned into a field hospital. He appeared to be running some kind of internal calculation that was coming back with numbers he did not expect. One by one, the others woke in the halting stages of men returning from the edge of hypothermia, disoriented, then alarmed, then registering their surroundings with the particular wariness of people accustomed to waking in unknown places. They were disciplined, Eleanor noticed. They checked on each other before themselves. They moved to the injured, of which there were several beyond grim too, with what would turn out to be frostbitten toes, one with a wrist that had been fractured in a fall, one with a deep gash on his forearm from the metal of his toppled bike. Eleanor treated what she could treat with the kit she had brought from the house. She had been a county nurse for 3 decades. She knew how to splint a wrist with what was available. She knew how to clean and close a wound with what was in a basic kit. She worked without being asked, moving from one man to the next, and the men she worked on submitted to her care with a wordless acquiescence that said more about her manner than it did about their dispositions. Raymond Coles woke last. His eyes opened and found her immediately, as if, even in unconsciousness, he had known where she was. They were gray, his eyes, the specific gray of sky before a serious storm, and they were alert in a way that the eyes of men just returning from hypothermia usually were not. He took in the barn with a single comprehensive scan, then looked back at her. "Who are you?" he said. "Eleanor Hargrove," she said. "You're in my barn." He tried to sit up, found his leg, and settled for propping himself on one elbow. His face registered the pain of the broken leg, the way competent men register pain, noting it, integrating it, moving on. He looked at Callum Reeves, the man everyone called Doc, who was nearby. "How bad?" he said. "Clean break," Doc said. "You'll heal. You're not riding for a while." Raymond Coles looked back at Eleanor. "You know who we are," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I can read patches," she said, "and I've seen your people around the county, and you still came out. You were dying in my driveway." He was quiet for a moment, measuring her. Most people would have called the sheriff and let the storm handle it. Eleanor looked at him over the soup pot. "Maybe so. Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Frank, about the thing he said, which was also the thing she believed, which was the thing she had believed before she met Frank, and that meeting him had only confirmed. She said, "My husband used to say that you don't get to choose who deserves help. You just choose whether to help." Grimm was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Where's your husband?" She kept her eyes on the pot. "Frank passed 18 months ago." The barn was quiet except for the wind outside and the low sound of the heater. She made soup. She made biscuits in her cast-iron Dutch oven the way Frank had asked her to make them every Sunday for 4 decades, and she served them in every container she had brought from the house. Bowls, mugs, a measuring cup, a ceramic mixing bowl with a hairline crack along one side. The men ate without talking, with the focused gratitude of the genuinely hungry. And when they were done, they sat in the warmth of the kerosene heater, and Eleanor sat among them on her hay bale, and Raymond Coles said, "Tell us about him." She hesitated. Frank had been hers privately and completely in the way that a long marriage makes one person the exclusive territory of another. She had not spoken about him, really spoken, not the "thank you for your condolences" version, but the actual speaking of a life since the funeral. The people of Redemption had offered their sympathy, and she had received it, and that had been the end of it. No one had asked her to remember him. No one had asked her to celebrate what he had been. So she told them. She told them about meeting Frank at a county fair in 1974 when she was 33 and he was 35, and he had been so obviously nervous asking for her phone number that she had felt tender toward him before she had even properly decided she liked him. She told them about the farm they had built together, the early years of working 2 jobs each, the way the land had slowly become theirs, in a way that went beyond the legal definition of ownership. She told them about Frank's laugh, which started in his chest and took its time arriving at his face, about his stubbornness, which was considerable, and which she had found both maddening and deeply reassuring, in the way that consistent things are reassuring when the world is inconsistent. about the children they had tried for and lost twice, and the grief of that, and how they had eventually set it down together in the particular way that couples who survive losses together learn to set things down, not forgotten, but integrated, carried differently. She told them about the end, about the medical bills that had started before the ambulance had left the driveway, about the stack of envelopes on the kitchen table that had grown all winter until it represented a number that bore no relationship to what a farm this size could generate in a lifetime, let alone the years she had left. About the foreclosure proceedings in the date in April, and the man who had appeared with an offer she had refused, and who had smiled with the particular smile of someone who knows they do not need you to cooperate because time is already working for them. She did not say any of this as complaint. She said it the way she said most things, plainly matter-of-factly, as information rather than appeal. She was not asking them for anything. She was answering a question that Raymond Coles had asked, and she answered it fully because Frank deserved to be described fully. When she finished, the barn was quiet. It was Brick who spoke first. His voice, which was the voice of a very large man accustomed to filling rooms with it, came out softer than she expected. "You gave us your food," he said. "Your winter stores. What are you going to eat?" "I'll manage." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." He looked at Grimm. Grimm was looking at Eleanor with an expression that she could not quite read. Not sympathy exactly, and not pity, which she would not have tolerated. Something more like recognition. The way one person looks at another when they have identified a quality they did not expect to find and are recalibrating accordingly. The storm broke just before dawn. Eleanor woke from a doze on her hay bale to a silence so complete after the hours of wind and noise that it had a physical quality like something pressing against her ears. She pushed open the barn door and stood in the opening. The world had been remade. 3 feet of snow lay over everything: the fields, the fence lines, the truck, the equipment shed, all of it smoothed and blanketed, and turned into a version of the landscape that was white and clean and indifferent to the concerns of the people who lived on it. The sun was coming up to the east, turning the snow pink and then gold, and for a moment Eleanor stood in the barn door and let herself simply see it, without the foreclosure and the bills and the empty chair at the kitchen table. Montana morning, she thought. Frank would have been up before her to see this. Grimm appeared at her shoulder, moving carefully on his makeshift crutch, a length of board that Doc had fashioned and bound with strips cut from a tarp. He stood beside her and looked out at the snow-covered farm without speaking. After a while he said, "It's a good piece of land." "It's a good piece of land," she agreed. They stood there together in the early light, and Eleanor thought, without meaning to, that this was the first time in 18 months that she had stood at the threshold of a Montana morning with another person beside her. The bikers spent the morning digging out their machines. They knew their bikes the way Eleanor knew her farm, not as objects, but as extensions of themselves, and they worked with a focused competence that she found she respected. Even the injured ones contributed what they could, handing tools, holding things steady, calling out assessments of damage with the shorthand of people who shared a language built from years of common practice. Before they left, they did something Eleanor had not expected. They cleared her driveway, all of them working with shovels she had not known she possessed until they found them in the equipment shed, working in teams moving systematically from the barn to the house to the gate at the county road. It took 3 hours. When they were done, the path was wider and cleaner than it had been in years. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Brick looked at her from a face that was still bearing the marks of the night before. "Yes, we did," he said. Raymond Coles was the last to leave. He had ridden the previous miles in the sidecar of Doc's bike, his broken leg extended in front of him, and before Doc started the engine, he climbed out and came to where Eleanor stood on her cleared porch. He held out a phone, the cheap kind, cracked plastic shell the weight of nothing. "One number in there," he said. "Mine. You need anything, and I mean anything, Mrs. Hargrove, you call. Day or night. I don't care what it is." Eleanor took the phone. She turned it over in her hands. "I won't need to," she said. His gray eyes held hers. "Promise me you'll keep it. Promise me you'll call if you need us." She looked at the phone. She thought about Frank and about the farm and about April 15th and about the man in the charcoal suit who would be back. She thought about what it meant to accept help and whether she was capable of it, and whether it mattered. All right, she said, I'll keep it. Grim extended his hand and she shook it, and she felt in his grip something that she recognized from the grip of other people who had lived hard and survived it. A steadiness, a weight, a quality of being entirely present in the moment of contact. We pay our debts, he said. Remember that. Then he was gone. 19 machines roaring to life, filling the cold air with noise, heading back down the county road in a formation that stretched as far as she could see before it curved out of sight around the tree line. Eleanor stood on her porch and listened until the sound faded entirely. She looked at the phone in her hand. She went inside and put it in the kitchen drawer. She did not expect to use it. 7 days later, Preston Calloway came to call. She heard the Mercedes before she saw it, recognizing the particular quality of an expensive engine on a county road not designed for expensive things. She was on the porch when it turned into the driveway, and she sat in her rocking chair and watched it come, and she did not stand when it stopped. Calloway got out with the same practiced smoothness as the engine that carried him. He was younger than she had expected, mid-40s perhaps, with the particular vitality of a man for whom money had solved most of the problems that aged other people. He walked to the porch steps and climbed them, and arranged himself against her porch railing with the comfort of a man who believes all spaces were designed to accommodate him. He introduced himself. She already knew the name. It appeared on 2 of the envelopes in her kitchen. He was the name at the end of the chain, the one the bank was selling to the one who had an interest in April 15th that was more personal than legal. He made his offer. It was, as she had expected, insulting in the specific way of offers designed not to be accepted, but to be declined so that the person making them can later say they tried. He mentioned the figure with a generosity in his voice that bore no relationship to the figure itself. Eleanor looked at him across the porch. "Get off my property," she said. His smile adjusted but did not leave. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm trying to help you here. The foreclosure is happening regardless. This way you walk away with something. I'd rather walk away with nothing than sell to you at any price." The smile thinned. "That's a sentiment I understand. Sentimental attachment to land is very human, very common. It doesn't change the legal situation." "I understand the legal situation," she said. "I've understood it for 3 months. Get off my porch." He stood for a moment measuring her, and she had the feeling of being assessed the way a problem is assessed, not with malice exactly, but with a kind of cold technical interest in the dimensions of an obstacle. Then he straightened and came down the porch steps and turned at the bottom of them. "April 15th. Mrs. Hargrove," he said. "The date doesn't change. I hope you'll use the time to reconsider. It would be a shame to end this without dignity." She said nothing. She watched him get into his Mercedes and drive back down the driveway and turn onto the county road and disappear. Then she sat in her rocking chair for a long time, looking at the fields that Frank had farmed for 4 decades and that she had kept going alone for 18 months, and she let herself feel the weight of it, not the despair of it, just the weight, because Frank had taught her that you had to feel the weight of things accurately before you could decide how to carry them. Then she went inside. She walked past the kitchen drawer with the burner phone in it. She was not ready. Not yet. She would not be ready for another 3 months, and it would take more than what Calloway had done to her to bring her to readiness. It would take what she found in a blue box in the barn, and what Doc's letter told her about 7 families she had never met, and the particular quality of a night alone with Frank's handwriting, and the full truth of what had been done. But that was still ahead of her. For now she set the kettle on, and she sat at Frank's table, and she looked at his empty chair, and she said to it quietly, the way she always said things to him, "Now I'm not going to make this easy for them, Frank." Outside, the January wind moved across the fields of the Hargrove farm, over the snow that covered the ground, where 19 men had nearly died, and 1 woman had refused to let them. The land did not comment. It never did. It simply held what happened on it, the way land always holds everything. The grief and the grace, the losses and the rescues, the ordinary days and the days that change everything. It held Eleanor Hargrove's footprints in the snow, already beginning to fill in, already beginning to disappear, the evidence of 19 trips into a killing cold, and back again, nearly invisible now, in the white quiet of a January morning in Montana. But the land remembered. The land always remembers. February came the way February always comes to that part of Montana, without apology, without relief, with the flat gray certainty of a season that has found its rhythm and intends to keep it. Eleanor woke every morning at 5:30, the same as she had woken every morning for 40 years, and she lay in the dark for exactly the amount of time it took her to remember that Frank was not on the other side of the bed. And then she rose and dressed and went to the kitchen and made coffee and began the day. This was not resilience. It was not courage. It was simply what you did when the alternative was lying in the dark indefinitely. And Eleanor Hargrove had never been a woman who could tolerate the dark indefinitely. The pantry told the story of January in plain terms. She had given the bikers most of what she had put up for the winter. At the time, standing in her kitchen loading boxes while the storm still threw itself against the windows, it had not felt like a calculation. It had felt like the obvious thing. You did not let people starve when you had food, and they did not. Frank had not raised her to do the mathematics of generosity before performing it. But February was doing the mathematics for her now. She had enough flour for perhaps 3 weeks of careful baking, enough canned goods for 2 weeks if she ate small. The root cellar had some potatoes, and the last of the winter squash, maybe 10 days' worth. She had sold the laying hens the previous autumn when she began to understand the shape of what was coming financially, which meant there were no eggs. The single pig she had kept, an old sow, named nothing in particular because Frank had always maintained that naming pigs was an act of emotional imprudence, had been slaughtered in November. The smoked meat from that was largely gone. She began to eat less without quite deciding to. It happened the way many things happen at her age, not as a dramatic choice, but as a series of small adjustments that accumulated into a condition. Half portions at breakfast, sometimes no lunch, dinner made to stretch. She lost weight that she had not had to spare, and she watched her hands grow thinner on the steering wheel of the truck, and did not mention it to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. She sold the last of her laying equipment to a man in Billings who came on a Saturday with a trailer and loaded it without conversation and paid her in cash, which she deposited in the account that the bank was already circling. She sold her second best set of tools to the hardware store in Redemption, which offered her less than they were worth, and she took it without negotiating because the calendar had become a physical presence in her kitchen, its pages turning at the same indifferent rate, regardless of what she needed more time to do. Through all of it, the burner phone sat in the kitchen drawer. She opened the drawer sometimes not to retrieve the phone, just opened it in the course of other things, looking for a pen or a rubber band, and she would see it there in the corner and acknowledge it the way you acknowledge a thing you have decided not to think about. She had made Raymond Coles a promise that she would keep it and call if she needed help, and she was a woman who kept her promises. But needing help was a condition she was still not ready to apply to herself. She had saved 19 men because they were dying in her driveway, and she was capable of saving them. She had not done it to create an obligation. She had not done it in anticipation of needing something in return. The moment she assigned a transactional quality to what had happened in January, she felt she would be diminishing it, reducing a human act to a barter arrangement, which was the kind of thing Preston Calloway did not, the kind of thing she and Frank had built their life around. So she closed the drawer, and she ate less, and she watched the calendar. The letter arrived on a Thursday in the first week of February. It came in a plain envelope with a Billings postmark and no return address, and Eleanor almost did not open it because she had developed a strong instinct against opening envelopes that arrived unannounced. She had learned in the last 18 months that envelopes contained primarily things she already knew in forms designed to make her feel worse about knowing them. But she opened it. Inside was a single page handwritten in a compact and precise script that she would later associate entirely with Callum Reeves, though she did not know his handwriting yet. It said, "Mrs. Hargrove, my name is Callum Reeves. I ride with the men you helped in January. I am writing because I have information you need to have, and because you deserve to know it, even if there is nothing to be done about it. First Territorial Bank and the man named Preston Calloway have done what is happening to you before. I have identified 7 other properties in this state over the past 2 years. All of the owners were older. All of them were alone. All of them lost their land. I am writing this down because you should know that what is happening to you was not an accident and was not simply the consequence of debt. Someone built this situation. I thought you should know that. I am sorry I cannot do more from where I am. C. Reeves. Eleanor read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, which was the table Frank had built in his second year on the farm from lumber. He had cut himself a table with the particular solidity of something made by hand to last, and she placed the letter on its surface and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand and looked at it. 7 families, 7 pieces of land, 7 lifetimes of work, 7 sets of people who had done nothing except grow old and carry debt and find themselves in the machinery of something that had been constructed to take from them what they had spent their lives building. She thought about the man who had stood on her porch with his polished shoes and his charcoal suit and his calculated courtesy. She thought about the particular ease with which he had delivered the date April 15th as if it were the weather, as if it were simply an event that was happening like rain or the changing of seasons unconnected to any decision that any person had made. Someone built this situation. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about Frank, about the months before he died, about the way his face had changed in the last weeks. Not just the physical deterioration which she had cataloged with the clinical precision of her training, but something behind his eyes, a worry that he had not shared with her. She had noticed it and attributed it to the fear of dying, which was a reasonable thing for a man to fear. And she had not pressed him on it because the fear of dying seemed like something a person was entitled to keep private if they chose. She had not pressed him. She wished now that she had pressed him. She folded Callum's letter and put it in the front pocket of her flannel shirt close to her chest, and she sat for another few minutes with her coffee going cold in front of her. Then she stood up because sitting and feeling things was a luxury that the situation did not presently afford, and she went to get her coat. The county road was clear enough to drive barely, and Eleanor made the 12 miles into Redemption in the truck that had once been Frank's, and that she had kept running through the winter by performing maintenance she had taught herself from repair manuals she had ordered from the library. She parked on the main street in front of the hardware store that had bought her tools at an insult price, and she sat in the truck for a moment looking at the town. Redemption was a small town in the way of many small Montana towns, built for a population and an economy that had both partially moved on its main street, carrying the mix of things that had survived and things that had adapted, and the empty windows of things that had done neither. Eleanor knew most of the faces here, had been the nurse for half of them at one point or another, had attended the funerals of parents and the births of grandchildren and the various crises that a county nurse witnesses across 3 decades of being the person you called when something was wrong and you were not sure what to do about it. She was looking for Norbert Stills, who had owned the Kellerman place 12 miles east until the previous spring when he had, according to what Eleanor had heard, sold it and moved to live with his daughter in Missoula. She had heard it as the ordinary news of an old man making a practical decision. She heard it differently now. She found him at the hardware store as it happened, buying small things. Screws, a hinge, the kind of minor hardware that people buy when they are visiting a place, and maintaining the habit of fixing things, even though the things they are fixing no longer belong to them. Norbert Stills was 73 years old and had the look of a man who had been removed from the thing that gave him his shape. Eleanor introduced herself. He remembered her, the county nurse Frank Hargrove's wife, a face from the years when the county had the density of people who knew each other's names as a matter of course. They talked for a few minutes about ordinary things, and then Eleanor asked him about the Kellerman property, and she watched his face change. He did not want to talk about it. She could see the not wanting to plainly, the way she had seen it in patients who did not want to talk about symptoms that frightened them. She waited the way she had learned to wait in 30 years of nursing, not pushing, not filling the silence, just remaining present in it until the other person decided what to do with it. He said, "It wasn't my choice to sell." She said, "I know." He looked at her. He had the eyes of someone who had been carrying something in a space too small for it. "First Territorial," he said, "and a man named Calloway. They had been working the numbers for 2 years before I even understood what was happening. By the time I understood, there was nothing to do. My lawyer said there was no case. My kid said, take what he's offering and get out." Eleanor said, "Did you try to report it?" He laughed, a short, unhappy sound. "Report it to who?" "The judge who signed the orders had Calloway's name on a building he dedicated 3 years ago. The bank president golfs with Calloway every second Saturday. I wrote to the state attorney general and got a form letter back." He paused. "I wrote twice." Eleanor thanked him and asked if there was anyone else she should speak to. He gave her two names, a woman named Doris Pruitt, who had lost a wheat farm east of town, a retired veterinarian named Carl Bauer, who had lost 40 acres on the river. Both of them still in the county. Both of them, Norbert said quietly, were afraid to make noise about it. "You're not afraid," Eleanor said. "I'm not afraid," he agreed. "I'm just done. There's a difference." Eleanor drove to see Doris Pruitt that afternoon. Doris met her at the door of a rented house on the edge of town, a small place with someone else's furniture and someone else's curtains. And they sat at a kitchen table that had nothing of Doris in it, and Eleanor listened while Doris described what had happened to her farm in the flat. Careful voice of a woman who has told the story enough times to have learned that telling it doesn't help, but has not yet learned to stop telling it. Eleanor recorded every word on Frank's old tape recorder, which she had found in the desk drawer, and slipped into her coat pocket before leaving home. She drove to see Carl Bauer the following morning. He did not invite her to sit down. He stood at the window of his rented house and looked out at the river he could see from there. His river, 40 acres of it, now fenced off with new wire that caught the February light and threw it back at nothing. He told her what had happened to him in the flat voice of a man who has accepted something he has not forgiven. He did not use the word stolen, but every other word he used meant it. Eleanor recorded that too. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table and played the recordings back, listening to the voices of three people describing what had been done to them, and she thought about what to do with what she had. The architecture of the thing was consistent across all three accounts. Calloway had identified properties with particular characteristics: older owners, medical debt, or other substantial liabilities, modest legal resources, and no family members positioned to intervene. He had, through relationships with First Territorial Bank and at least one county official, engineered the conditions under which those liabilities became unmanageable. Then he had arrived with an offer and a smile and a date. 7 times in 2 years. Eleanor wrote a letter to the State Attorney General's office in Helena. She described what she had learned, attached a summary of the connections she had identified, referenced the 7 properties she could name. She mailed it certified. She wrote a similar letter to the investigative desk of the Helena Independent Record, which was the largest paper in the state, in which she had read had published pieces on financial impropriety in rural land transactions within the past year. She mailed that one certified as well. She called the county courthouse to inquire about the records of the foreclosure proceedings and was told that the file was public and available for inspection, and she drove in on a Tuesday and sat for 3 hours at a reading table while a clerk watched her from behind a counter, and she made notes in Frank's small spiral notebook on every document in the file. She did this carefully and completely, the way she had kept patient records for 30 years. Not because she knew exactly what she was looking for, but because she knew that thoroughness was the only way to find what you did not know you were looking for. The response from the Attorney General's office arrived in 12 days. It was a form letter. The newspaper did not respond at all. Eleanor put both of these outcomes in the category of things she had already half expected and continued. She was not a person who revised her assessment of what needed to be done based on whether the first attempt to do it had succeeded. She had worked in a county hospital for 3 decades. She knew that the first treatment sometimes did not take. You assessed, adjusted, tried again. But the calendar was now into March, and April 15th was 6 weeks away, and Eleanor was beginning to feel the arithmetic of the situation pressing against her from 2 directions at once: the time remaining and the resources available. And she understood for the first time that she was not going to resolve this through letters and formal channels in 6 weeks. The system that was taking her farm was using the system's own instruments. It had a judge and a bank and a legal structure and a man in a charcoal suit who had done this 7 times before without consequence. What she had was a tape recorder and a spiral notebook and a burner phone in a kitchen drawer. She needed to think about that more carefully. It was in the 2nd week of March that she found the box. She had been doing what she had been putting off doing for weeks, going through Frank's things in the barn. Not the tools which she had maintained and used and related to as functional objects rather than relics. His personal things. The shelf in the back corner of the barn where he kept the items that were his in the particular way that things are yours when you have always had a place for them and they have always been there. There was not much. Frank had been a man who held on to very little. A penknife, a photograph of his parents in front of a house Eleanor did not recognize, taken sometime in the 1950s. A Bible with the spine repaired twice. A small, carved wooden horse his grandfather had made. And a box. It was a metal document box of the kind sold in office supply stores, painted blue with a clasp that was not locked. She had seen it on that shelf for 40 years and never thought to ask about it because Frank was not a man who kept secrets, and a box in plain sight on a shelf did not suggest concealment so much as filing. She picked it up and found it heavier than she expected, and she carried it out of the barn into the late winter light and set it on the tailgate of the truck and opened the clasp. Inside was a manila envelope sealed with her name on it in Frank's handwriting. Her name. Not to whom it may concern, not any of the formal language of legal documents. Just Ellie in the hand she had read 10,000 times on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter for 41 years. She sat down on the tailgate with the envelope in her hands. She sat there for a long time before she opened it. Inside the envelope was a letter 7 pages in Frank's handwriting, and behind the letter was a second smaller envelope that was also sealed. And behind that were printed documents, photocopies of documents, pages of handwritten notes, receipts, and a small flash drive that she did not immediately know what to do with. She read the letter. Frank had written it in the last month of his life. She realized the handwriting was more labored than his usual, the letters larger and less certain, the way his handwriting had gotten in the weeks when the blood pressure issues had begun to affect his steadiness. He had written it knowing he was running out of time to write it. He had noticed the billing irregularities within 2 months of his first hospitalization. Frank was not a sophisticated financial analyst, but he had kept the farm's books by hand for 40 years, and he understood numbers with the practical precision of a man who had never been able to afford to misunderstand them. The charges from Redemption County Medical Center had not looked right to him. Not wrong in a random way, not simple errors, but wrong in a pattern that pointed consistently in the same direction. He had begun to document it, quietly, methodically, in the way Frank did everything, keeping copies of every bill, every insurance correspondence, every EOB statement, cross-referencing numbers that did not reconcile, noting discrepancies in dates and itemizations and charge codes. He had contacted a lawyer in Billings, a woman he had found through the State Bar Association, and he had mailed her a copy of his documentation. 3 days later, a man had come to the farm. Frank had not recognized him, had never seen him before. The man had been polite, even cordial. He had said that he understood Frank was asking questions about certain financial matters, and that asking questions was of course Frank's right, but that certain parties were aware of the questions, and that it might be worth Frank's consideration whether the potential outcomes of continuing to ask them were proportionate to the costs. It had been, Frank wrote, the most frightening conversation of his life, not because the man had made any direct threat. He had been scrupulously indirect. But Frank had been a man who had lived in the world for 75 years, and he understood what was being communicated without being stated. He had stopped. He had told himself he was protecting Eleanor. He had told himself that a farm and a debt and a billing dispute were not worth whatever the alternative was. He had stopped asking questions, and he had kept the documentation, and he had put it in the blue box in the barn, and he had told himself he would decide what to do about it when he felt stronger, when the health situation stabilized, when there was more time. There had not been more time. He wrote in the letter's final page in handwriting that had become very large and very slow, as if each word had been placed there with deliberate effort. Ellie, I am sorry I didn't tell you. I was trying to protect you, and I think what I actually did was leave you without what you needed. The flash drive has everything. The files have everything. I hope you never need any of it. I hope the bills get paid some other way, and this box stays in the barn until the barn falls down. But if it comes to the worst, what's in here is enough. I know it's enough because the lawyer in Billings said so before I lost my nerve. You were always braver than me. I always knew that. I should have let you be brave about this sooner. I love you. Frank. Eleanor sat on the tailgate of the truck in the March light and read the last page 3 times. She did not cry. Not there, not on the tailgate. She would cry later in the kitchen quietly for about 20 minutes, And then she would stop and wash her face and feel something that was not entirely grief, something that had anger in it and purpose and the particular quality of a fire that has been given additional fuel after burning low for a long time. But sitting on the tailgate, she simply read the last page 3 times, and then she put everything carefully back in the box and closed the clasp and took it inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the box in front of her. She drove to the Redemption Public Library the following morning and sat at one of the public computer terminals for 4 hours working through the contents of the flash drive with the methodical patience she brought to things that required it. The head librarian, Agnes Whitfield, came by at some point and asked what she was working on, the way Agnes always asked, because Agnes had kept a daily log of everything that happened in her library since 1987 and regarded knowing what her patrons were doing as a professional obligation. Eleanor told her she was reviewing her late husband's papers. Agnes noted it in her composition notebook and moved on. What Frank had assembled over months of careful collection was a documentary record of a billing scheme that went considerably beyond the overcharging of a single patient. There were comparison documents showing that the charges applied to Frank's account were systematically 3 to 4 times the standard Medicare rates for the same procedures. There were internal hospital documents that Frank had obtained through a source he did not name in his notes, showing that these inflated charges were applied selectively to patients on specific insurance plans, patients whose coverage was administered through First Territorial's insurance division, a division Eleanor had not known existed until she read it in Frank's documentation. There was a paper trail, incomplete but directional, connecting Redemption County Medical Center's billing practices to First Territorial Bank's loan portfolio, specifically to a product called a Medical Emergency Bridge Loan, which First Territorial had aggressively marketed to patients at Redemption County Medical who were carrying large balances and which carried interest rates that compounded in ways the marketing materials did not make explicit. Frank had not gotten all of it. He had gotten enough. Eleanor copied everything onto a USB drive she bought at the library's front desk for $4. She put the original flash drive back in the blue box. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table again, and this time she opened the kitchen drawer and took out the burner phone, and she held it in both hands for the span of time it took the late afternoon light to move a foot across the kitchen floor. She was not calling to be rescued. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was not the woman calling because she was cornered and out of options and desperate. She did not believe in being that woman. Frank had not believed in being that man. She was calling because she had something that needed to reach people who could use it, and she had 6 weeks, and the official channels had already demonstrated their intentions, and the man who had built this system was not going to be stopped by a certified letter. She was calling because Frank had tried alone, and it had not been enough, and she was not going to repeat that mistake. She was calling because there were 7 other families, and whatever happened on April 15th on the Hargrove farm, those families deserved someone to fight for what had been taken from them. She dialed the number. It rang once. "Raymond," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove." His voice was immediate, unhurried, as if he had been expecting this call at this exact moment on this exact afternoon. "How are you doing?" "I've been better," she said. "I have something you need to see." There was a pause. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, still steady, still calm, but with something beneath it now, something that had been waiting. "Ellie," he said, "Hell's Iron has been looking at Callaway for 6 weeks. We've been building something, but there's a piece we've been missing." He paused. "I think you just found it." She felt something move in her chest. Not surprise exactly, more like the feeling of a thing clicking into place that had been slightly wrong for a long time. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since Doc wrote you the letter. He told me what he'd found. I told him to write you. I wanted you to know what you were dealing with. We've been working the problem from our end since January, but we needed something from inside the financial chain, and we couldn't get there without it." She looked at the USB drive on the table in front of her. "Frank got there," she said, "before he died. He got there and he left it for me in the barn." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She thought about what it meant for a man like Raymond Coles to be briefly quiet on the other end of a phone. Then he said quietly, and with a directness that she had come to understand was his particular form of respect tomorrow, "We'll come to you. Bring everything you have." She almost said, "You don't have to." She stopped herself because it was the habitual reflex of a woman who had spent 80 years not asking for help, and because Frank had told her in a letter written in failing handwriting from the last weeks of his life that she was braver than she knew and that she should have let that bravery extend further. All right, she said. She put the phone down and sat with the last of the evening light crossing the kitchen table. Outside, the March wind moved through the bare branches of the elm that Frank had planted in the first year they owned the farm. It was the tree he had measured every spring with a stick in a hand, noting its growth in the same small notebook where he recorded rainfall and first frost dates. It was 41 years old, and it was enormous now, its canopy reaching almost to the roofline, and it was still there, still standing, still growing. He had planted it for a future he would not see. She understood that now in a way she had not before. She thought about what he had written. You were always braver than me. She had not known he felt that way. In 41 years, she had not known. She thought she might have said something to him about it if she had known. Something inadequate, probably. Something that would have embarrassed both of them and made them both laugh about being embarrassed. Something true. Raymond came the next morning with Doc and 4 others, and they sat at Frank's kitchen table for 3 hours while Eleanor went through everything in the blue box and on the USB drive piece by piece with the same systematic attention she had brought to it at the library. The men listened without interrupting. Doc made notes in a small notebook. Raymond asked 3 questions over the course of the entire morning, each one precise, each one landing exactly on the thing Eleanor had not yet articulated but had been circling. When they were done, Raymond looked at the blue box and then at Eleanor. Frank built the foundation, he said. Doc has the rest of the structure. We need to put them together and we need to move fast. How fast, Eleanor said. The FBI field office in Billings, Raymond said. We have a contact there. We need everything filed and verified before the 15th. That gives us roughly 5 weeks. He looked at her steadily. We'll handle the filing. We'll handle the legal contacts. But Ellie, if this goes the way it should, Calloway is going to come after the source of the documents. He's going to come after you. Are you ready for that? She thought about Frank's handwriting getting larger and slower on that final page, about the conversation with the man who had come to the farm and delivered his scrupulously indirect message and left Frank afraid for the rest of his life. I've been ready, she said, since I found the box. Raymond nodded once. That was enough. He called her 3 more times in the weeks that followed. The second call was practical. He told her that Doc had located a former 1st Territorial employee who had retained copies of internal communications and was prepared to cooperate with federal investigators. The third call was brief. The FBI had confirmed receipt of the complete evidence package. The fourth was the shortest. We filed everything with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Billings yesterday morning. It's in their hands now. Whatever happens on the 15th, the case exists. She asked how many would come on April 15th. He said enough. She understood from the quality of those 2 words that the number was not going to be small, and she did not ask again. The morning of April 14th, Eleanor woke at 5:30 and lay in the dark and listened to the farm. She had been awake most of the night, not with fear, but with something more like the focused wakefulness of the night before a procedure, that specific kind of alertness that exists at the intersection of preparation and the acknowledgement that preparation is now complete and what comes next is out of your hands. She got up. She dressed in the good clothes she had set out the night before. Not her best, which was a navy dress she wore to funerals, but her good flannel shirt, clean and pressed, and her good boots, and Frank's old barn jacket that she had been wearing since November because it was warmer than her own and because it smelled like him, or had smelled like him, though the smell had faded now to a point where she was no longer sure if she was smelling it or remembering it. She made coffee. She scrambled eggs from the dozen she had bought in town on Monday, allowing herself a full portion because this morning seemed to call for it. She ate slowly at the kitchen table with Frank's mug on the other side of the table and the wooden box in front of her, and the dawn coming up slow and pink through the kitchen window. By 9:30, the farm was washed in spring light, the last of the winter brown, giving way at the edges of the fields to the first faint green of new growth. Eleanor sat on the porch in her rocking chair with the wooden box on her lap, and she waited. The Mercedes appeared at the end of the driveway at 10 minutes to 10, followed by the flatbed with the bulldozer, followed by the white pickups with the men in sunglasses, followed by Sheriff Hutchins in his cruiser, followed by a dark sedan that she recognized as belonging to Calloway's legal team, because it had been there in March when he sent his lawyers to make a second offer she had not answered. Preston Calloway got out of his car with the same ease he always had. Charcoal suit, polished shoes, the manila envelope. He walked to the porch steps and climbed them and stood before her, and she let him stand there and talk because she had found over the course of a winter and a spring that she no longer had any particular feelings about Preston Calloway beyond the clean, uncomplicated desire to see him stopped. He talked about the legal order. He talked about the bank. He talked about the date April 15th as if she had possibly forgotten it. He talked about dignity and reasonable conclusions and the wisdom of accepting outcomes that could not be changed. She listened. Then he said the thing that she had been expecting him to say because men like Preston Calloway always said this thing. It was the thing they saved, the thing they believed had weight, the sharpest instrument in a limited kit. He said, "You're alone, Mrs. Hargrove. You've always been alone. There is no one coming. There is no one who cares what happens to you here today." Eleanor looked at him across the porch. Then she looked at her watch. Then she looked past him to the east to the long flat line where her wheat fields met the April sky. 3 minutes, she said. Calloway frowned. He began to speak again, something about the sheriff, something about the bulldozer, something about the process proceeding regardless. The ground began to tremble. It started the way it had started in January, barely perceptible, at first a faint vibration that might have been a truck on the distant highway. Preston Calloway did not recognize it. He kept talking, his voice carrying the momentum of a man who has said these same things in these same circumstances enough times that the words have become reflexive. But Sheriff Dale Hutchins recognized it. Eleanor saw it in his face from across the yard, the way his chin lifted, the way his hand came off his holster. Slowly, the way he turned toward the east with an expression that was equal parts professional assessment and something that looked very much like relief. The vibration became a rumble. The rumble became a roar. The roar became the horizon itself coming apart, the flat eastern line dissolving into motion and chrome, and the percussion of 500 engines running wide open across a Montana morning. Preston Calloway turned. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then comprehension, then something that she recognized from her years as a nurse as the specific physiological presentation of genuine fear. The blood leaving the surface, the jaw going slightly loose, the eyes doing the rapid calculation of a man reassessing his position in a situation that has changed categorically. Eleanor did not look at him. She looked east at the wave of people still coming over the rise, and she thought, "Frank, look what you started. With your blue box and your careful notes and your 7 pages of labored handwriting. Look what you started and didn't know you started because you were afraid and you were trying to protect me, and you kept the box anyway." The motorcycles came over the eastern rise like a wave breaking in slow motion. Chrome catching the April light, the sound of them filling the valley and the fields and the sky above the Hargrove farm. They kept coming. They did not stop coming. They flowed down the county road and turned into Eleanor's driveway and spread across her fields and lined her fence lines and filled every space that was available to be filled, and still more came over the rise. She had not asked how many. She understood now why Raymond had not told her. Some numbers are better experienced than anticipated. Sheriff Dale Hutchins walked away from Preston Calloway's convoy and toward his own cruiser and leaned against the hood of it with his arms folded, and his face had settled into an expression of studied neutrality that Eleanor recognized as a man who has decided which version of himself he intends to be today. The men in sunglasses got back in their white pickups. The bulldozer operator climbed down from his cab and stood beside his machine with the demeanor of a man who had not been paid enough for this particular Tuesday. Preston Calloway stood on Eleanor Hargrove's porch, and the calculation behind his eyes was complete now, and the number it had returned was not the number he had expected when he drove down this driveway an hour ago. The last of the 500 settled into their places across the fields, engines idling down to a low collective rumble. And through the corridor they had left, Raymond Coles came walking toward the porch. Preston Calloway had not moved. He had the quality of a man who was still calculating and finding that each new calculation returned the same answer he did not want. Raymond walked through his people the way water moves through stone, not forcing anything, not requiring anything to move aside, simply finding the path that was already there and following it with the unhurried certainty of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended to arrive. He climbed Eleanor's porch steps without hurrying. He stood before her rocking chair, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that she had come to understand held more than they showed. Behind him, Brick came to the foot of the steps and stopped. Doc Reeves came and stood beside Brick. And behind them in the yard, in the fields, and along the fence lines, 500 people sat on their machines and watched, in a silence that was not the absence of sound, so much as the deliberate withholding of it. Raymond looked at Calloway. He did not raise his voice. "You're on our friend's property," he said. "Leave." Calloway found something in himself that Eleanor suspected was the last reserve of a man who had operated without consequence for long enough to have confused that condition with safety. He held up the manila envelope, and his voice carried the particular tone of someone deploying a document as a shield. "I have a court order," he said, "signed by Judge Patterson. This property transferred to First Territorial Bank at 8 this morning and was sold to my company before 9. Legally, you are all trespassing. Every single one of you. I will have every person on this property arrested." The 500 engines idled. Raymond Coles did not look at the envelope. "You have 30 seconds, he said. Calloway looked past Raymond to the yard, to the fields, to the 500 people arranged across every surface of Eleanor Hargrove's farm. He looked at Sheriff Hutchins, who was leaning against his cruiser with his arms folded and his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that communicated to anyone fluent in the language of men who have made decisions that he had made one. 20 seconds, Raymond said. One of Calloway's security men, the larger of the two, leaned out of the passenger window of the white pickup and said something to Calloway in a low voice. Calloway turned to hear it. Whatever he heard reduced the last of the structural support in his posture. Brick, standing at the foot of the porch steps, cracked his knuckles. The sound was unremarkable in itself, in the context of 500 people watching from every direction it carried. Preston Calloway descended Eleanor's porch steps. He did it quickly without looking at her, which was the first honest thing he had done all morning. He crossed the yard to his Mercedes, and he got inside, and the engine started, and the white pickups fell in behind him, and the small convoy moved down the driveway through the corridor of motorcycles, and the people on either side watched it go without comment, without gesture, with the particular stillness of people who understand that the appropriate response to a rout is to let it complete itself with dignity. The bulldozer operator reversed his machine carefully off the flatbed, drove it 20 yards into the field, stopped the engine, climbed down, and walked to the road and stood there with his hands in his pockets, waiting for someone to come get him. He did not appear to have any strong feelings about whose side he was on. The Mercedes reached the county road and turned and was gone. The sound of 500 engines idling filled the space where the convoy had been. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair with Frank's box on her lap and watched the dust of Calloway's departure settle back onto the driveway, and she felt something that she did not have an immediate word for. It was not relief exactly, because relief implied that the fear had been present in a way that she had not quite allowed. It was not triumph, because triumph required an opponent worthy of it, and she had never quite managed to see Calloway as worthy of anything. It was something quieter, something that had to do with the specific weight that lifts when a thing you have been carrying for a long time is set down. Raymond turned back to her from where he had been watching the driveway. He sat down on the top porch step, not in the second rocking chair, which was Frank's, which she had kept in its place all winter, as a matter of principle that she had not examined closely. He sat on the step with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at her with the directness that was his characteristic mode. "How are you doing?" he said. "I've been better," she said, "and I've been considerably worse." He nodded. Doc climbed the steps and set a duffel bag on the porch boards between them. It was black nylon, military style, and it was heavy enough that it landed with a weight that communicated its contents before he opened it. He unzipped it and folded back the sides. Eleanor looked at the stacks of banded bills arranged inside with the neatness of something that had been assembled carefully. $200,000, Doc said. The full outstanding balance on the mortgage, including compounded interest and all legal fees associated with the foreclosure proceedings, plus enough additional to cover your property taxes for the next 5 years. Eleanor looked at the money. She looked at Doc. She looked at Raymond on the step. "I can't accept this," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the same voice she used for saying difficult things that needed to be said without drama, which was the voice she used for most things. Raymond said, "You're not accepting it. Then what am I doing?" "You're receiving a debt payment." He said it with the simple finality of someone explaining arithmetic. "You saved 19 lives in January. This is what 19 lives are worth to us. This is the minimum of what they're worth. We've argued about this actually, and there are people here today who think the number should be higher." "That's not," Eleanor began. "You did not save us so that we would owe you," Raymond said. "I know that. You did it because Frank told you to, and because you are the kind of person who does what Frank told you." He paused. "But what you did has a value that exists independently of your reasons for doing it. And we are people who understand that debts are real, that they have to be honored, not because of what it does for you, because of what it means for us to be people who honor them." Brick from the foot of the steps said, "You know what the honest truth is, Mrs. Hargrove?" She looked at him. "In probably 20 years," he said, speaking with the careful deliberateness of a large man choosing his words, "I have not been carried anywhere. I have not been taken care of by anybody. I have mostly operated on the assumption that I was the one who did the carrying and the taking care of, and that this was the appropriate arrangement." He stopped. "You dragged me 100 yards through a blizzard at 80 years old. You did that, and then you made us biscuits." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know how to account for that except to be here." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Frank," she said, "would have said, 'I just did what needed doing.' Raymond said, 'That is exactly why we're here. People who just do what needs doing are the rarest people there are." There was a quality to the moment that Eleanor recognized from certain rooms she had sat in over 30 years of nursing rooms, where something true was being said between people who were not accustomed to saying true things to each other, where the truth arrived with a weight that required everyone in the room to hold still for a moment and let it settle. She looked at the money in the duffel bag. She thought about Frank's letter, about the 7 pages in failing handwriting, about, "I hope you never need any of it." "All right," she said. Raymond looked at her. "I'll take it," she said, "and I will not pretend it isn't one of the hardest things I have done. But I understand what you're saying, and I believe you mean it. And Frank would have told me that refusing help when it's offered honestly is its own kind of pride and not the good kind." Raymond nodded once. Doc picked up the duffel bag and took it inside, and Eleanor heard him setting it on the kitchen table where a different kind of weight had rested all winter. She heard him on her phone making calls, beginning the process of unwinding the machinery that had been assembled against her farm. Raymond remained on the step. He reached inside his cut and produced a manila envelope of his own, thicker than Calloway's and heavier, and carrying the particular density of documents that had been assembled with care over time. "There's something else," he said. He held it out to her. She opened it. The first page was a summary document, single-spaced, 3 pages long, with footnotes that referenced the documents behind it. Eleanor read it with the focused attention she gave to things that required focused attention, which was the same attention she had given to patient charts and insurance forms and Frank's handwritten notes on the flash drive. She read it completely before she reacted to any part of it. What Doc had assembled in combination with what Frank had left in the blue box was a documentary record of a scheme that went considerably further than a billing irregularity at a single hospital. It was a system. It had been designed as a system, operated as a system, and sustained across at least 4 years by the cooperation of at least 7 named individuals, including 2 officers of First Territorial Bank, a member of the county zoning board, and the Honorable Gerald Patterson of the 9th District Court, whose name appeared on the foreclosure orders for 6 of the 8 properties, including Eleanor's. The total value of land acquired through the scheme at market rates was approximately $14 million. The total amount by which hospital bills had been inflated across the identified patient accounts was approximately $2 million. The total amount received by First Territorial in interest and fees on the medical emergency bridge loans was approximately $900,000. Frank's documentation covered roughly 1/3 of this picture. Doc's work covered another third. The final third had come from the former First Territorial employee who had retained copies of internal communications and who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. Copies of the complete package had been provided to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in Billings, the Montana State Attorney General's Office, the United States Attorney for the District of Montana, and the investigative desks of 3 newspapers, including the Helena Independent Record and the Associated Press Montana Bureau. They had been delivered the previous morning. Eleanor lowered the papers to her lap. She looked at the April light on her fields, at the wheat coming up in the ground that Frank had farmed, at the elm tree by the house, enormous and rooted its canopy reaching past the roofline, growing without Frank's annual measurement, but growing regardless. Frank, she thought, you started this. You started it alone, and you were afraid, and you stopped because you were trying to protect me. And I understand that. I have always understood that about you, the way protecting the people you love sometimes made you smaller than you were. But you kept the box. You kept everything you had found, and you put my name on the envelope, and you left it where I would find it. You knew I would find it. She realized her face was wet, and she did not remember it starting. She did not wipe it for a moment. She let it be because Frank had always said that there was no dignity in refusing to feel things, that the dignity was in feeling them and continuing anyway, and she had spent enough of the last 18 months refusing. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at Raymond. He looked back at her without expression, which was the most respectful thing he could have done. This is Frank's work, she said. It's Frank's work and your work, Raymond said. You found it. You called us. She shook her head slightly. I found it because he left it for me. He was protecting me all along. Even after he was gone, this man was still trying to protect me. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said I had a father who was not worth a damn. Most of the people here today had fathers who were not worth a damn or had no fathers at all. He looked out at the yard at the 500 people who were beginning to move, now beginning to talk quietly among themselves, beginning the small shifts of a gathered crowd that has accomplished what it came to accomplish. He said, I've thought about Frank a good deal since January, since you told us about him that night in the barn. And what I keep coming back to is that a man who spends 40 years loving someone the way he loved you, and then spends the last months of his life trying to protect her from something he was afraid of, that's not a man who failed. That's a man who did everything he could with everything he had. Eleanor looked at the elm tree. Frank had measured it every spring in that small notebook. He had planted it for a future he would not see, tended it for decades, without needing it to be anything other than what it was growing toward. He had understood something that she was still learning, which was that the things worth doing were the things that outlasted the doing of them. He had more to give than he knew, she said. Most people do, Raymond said. It was then that the situation changed for the second time that morning. Eleanor's regular phone rang from inside the house, and Doc appeared in the doorway a moment later with an expression that she had learned to read as the expression he wore when information had arrived that was operational rather than merely interesting. Calloway just filed an emergency motion, Doc said. His lawyer was apparently waiting at the county courthouse. They had this prepared as a contingency, filed within 20 minutes of him leaving the driveway. He's claiming the documents are fabricated. His lawyer is arguing that the evidence package was assembled through unauthorized access to private financial records and that any investigation based on it is proceeding on tainted evidence. He's also filed a separate complaint with the county sheriff's office, alleging that you, he nodded at Eleanor, conspired with Hell's Iron to manufacture the debt records and that the original mortgage documents were falsified. Eleanor looked at him steadily. He's trying to make me the criminal. He's trying to collapse the whole case by attacking the source. Doc's voice was level. If he can make you the story, make it about a biker club fabricating evidence to steal a developer's property, he buries what's in those documents under enough noise and procedural delay that he might walk. Raymond had stood up from the porch step. His face had gone to the flat, still quality that Eleanor had come to understand was what his face did when he was thinking rather than reacting. How does it get resolved, Eleanor said. Doc said the chain of custody on the documents needs to be established independently. Frank's materials are the foundation. His name, his handwriting, the timeline of when he collected what he collected. If someone can verify that the documents predate any involvement by us, that they existed before January and before any contact with the club, then Calloway's fabrication argument falls apart completely. Eleanor understood immediately. The library, she said. I use the public computer terminals in the Redemption Library to review the flash drive. In early March, there will be a record of that session. Doc nodded. And Frank's letter. The handwriting analysis, the paper, the ink. A forensic document examiner could establish when it was written. His medical records would corroborate the timeline. The librarian's name is Agnes Whitfield, Eleanor said. She's been the head librarian for 20 years. She will remember me being there because she always remembers everyone. And because she asked me what I was working on, and I told her I was reviewing my late husband's papers. She noted it down in her daily log, which she keeps in a composition notebook on the desk. Because Agnes Whitfield has kept a daily log of everything that happens in her library since 1987. Raymond turned his head toward Doc. Doc was already on his phone, but it was Sheriff Dale Hutchins who resolved it. He had been standing by his cruiser through all of it, a fact that Eleanor had been aware of at the edge of her attention. He was not a bad man. She had known that in January when she had watched his face as he climbed out of his car, the face of a man who had agreed to do something that was not sitting easily. She had known it more clearly in the morning's final minutes before the motorcycles came over the rise, when she had watched him make the decision to step back. He walked across the yard and climbed the porch steps and stood before Eleanor with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Dale." "I do," he said. He said it with the specific gravity of a man who has thought about what he owes and has come here intending to pay it. "I knew something was wrong with the Patterson foreclosures. I've known for a year. I told myself it wasn't my jurisdiction. I told myself the legal process was the legal process." He stopped. "I told myself a lot of things that were true enough to stand behind when I didn't want to look at what was behind them." Eleanor looked at him. "I had a conversation with Calloway," he said. 2 weeks ago, he called me and he told me what he expected from me today, and he told me what would happen to my career if I didn't deliver it." He paused. "I recorded that conversation. Both of them, actually. I recorded the one from 2 weeks ago and the one from last November when he first approached me. I have them on my personal recorder, which I keep in my cruiser." Eleanor said nothing. "Hutchins said I was going to use them if I needed to. I wasn't sure I was going to need to until this morning, until I stood in this yard and watched a woman I've known for 20 years sit in a rocking chair with her dead husband's photographs and wait for a court order to knock down her house." He reached into his jacket and produced a small digital recorder. "I'd like to provide these to the FBI," he said, "to the U.S. Attorney's Office, to whoever is the appropriate recipient. I'd like to do that today, and I'd like to do it publicly, and I would like it on record that I am doing it voluntarily and without any arrangement or agreement with any other party." He looked at Raymond Coles when he said this last part. Raymond looked back at him with the gray eyes that held more than they showed, and something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the particular recognition of two men who have each made a decision this morning and can identify that quality in the other. Doc stepped forward and said, "There's an FBI agent in Billings waiting for a call." Hutchins said, "Let's make it." They went inside together, Doc and Hutchins, to the kitchen where the duffel bag of money sat on Frank's table, and Eleanor sat on the porch and listened to the sounds of the farm around her. The 500 were not idle. She became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for a while, but that you have not consciously registered. Across the yard in the fields, people had begun to move with purpose. Someone had found her toolbox in the equipment shed, and a group of 6 was examining the barn door that had hung crooked on its lower hinge since the previous autumn. 3 people were on the roof of the chicken coop, replacing shingles with materials she did not know they had brought. A woman she did not recognize was on a ladder at the side of the house, painting the fascia board that had begun to rot at the north corner. She had not asked for any of this. Brick appeared beside the porch with a set of carpenter's tools on his belt and the expression of a man who has found a problem he knows how to solve. "Your front steps," he said, nodding at the 3 porch steps. "The bottom one's soft. The other 2 need to be reset. I've got the lumber in my saddlebag if you believe it." Eleanor looked at the steps. She had been aware of the bottom one for 2 years, the way you are aware of things that need doing when you do not have the time or the help to do them. "I believe it," she said. He got to work without further conversation, which was his particular form of grace. the grace of a man who expresses things through the doing of them. Eleanor sat on the porch through the afternoon and watched her farm come back to life around her. It was not a metaphor, it was literal. The barn door was rehung level and square and stopped complaining when it opened. The chicken coop roof was re-shingled. The fascia board was repainted, and two other soft boards on the house's north side were identified and replaced before Eleanor had known they needed replacing. Frank's tractor, which had been running poorly since November on a problem that Eleanor had diagnosed as the fuel injectors, but had not had the resources to address, was surrounded by four people, including a young woman with an engineering tattoo on her forearm, who pulled the injectors, cleaned them, reinstalled them, and had the engine running smooth in under 2 hours. A man Eleanor had not met before backed a pickup truck to her kitchen door and began unloading things. Groceries first, not the single items of someone restocking a shelf, but the quantities of a pantry being filled for a season. Then household supplies. Then improbably new curtains for the kitchen window, a replacement for the ones that had faded to a colorless exhaustion over the decade. "I didn't ask for any of this," Eleanor said from the doorway. The man looked at her. He was perhaps 45 with the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outside. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "But Grimm said what you did for us in January, and I figured the curtains you've got are about done." Eleanor looked at the curtains. They were objectively about done. She stepped aside and let him in. As the afternoon moved toward evening, people began to drift toward the fire pits that had appeared in the yard with the same unannounced practicality as everything else that day. Wood had been sourced from somewhere. Grills had materialized. The smell of food began to move across the farm on the spring air. Something large on a spit, something smaller on a flat grill. The particular smell of a serious meal being prepared by people who knew how to prepare it. Raymond found Eleanor on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the western ridge. He had something else with him. He stood at the porch railing and set it on the rail between them without preamble. It was a deed. Eleanor looked at it. "That's not mine," she said. "I know what my deed looks like." "No," he said. "It's for the 10 acres to the east, the Wicker parcel. Has been empty since old Joe Wicker passed in 2019, and his kids couldn't agree on what to do with it." Eleanor was familiar with the Wicker parcel. She had watched it go fallow for 5 years. "We bought it this morning," Raymond said, "before we came here. Closed on it at 8:30. She looked at him. "Hell's Iron needs a proper base in this part of the state," he said. "Not a bar, not a garage, a place. A permanent place with a structure built right where we can meet and work and be something that's part of a community rather than just passing through it." He paused. "We'd like to be your neighbors if you'll have us." Eleanor looked at the deed and then at Raymond and then at the 10 acres to the east fallow and waiting running along her fence line. "You're staying," she said. "We're putting down roots," he said, "which is a thing most of us have not done before and are going to be learning as we go." She thought about Frank, about the elm tree he had planted in year 1, measuring it every spring, not because he expected to see its full height, but because some things you plant for the future rather than for yourself. "Frank always said this land was meant to be filled with family," she said. Raymond said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Most of us never had that. Family the way you mean it. People who stay. People who show up and stay." Eleanor looked at the field, at the new wheat coming in at the elm tree, enormous against the evening sky, at the farm that had almost ended today and had not. "I think," she said, "that Frank would say that family is mostly something you choose rather than something you're given, and that the choosing is what makes it real." Raymond Coles, who had ridden with Hell's Iron for 23 years, and who had spent most of those years being something the world feared, stood at Eleanor Hargrove's porch railing in the April evening and did not say anything for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. Then he said, "I think Frank was right." Doc sat with her later that evening and told her what the FBI agent in Billings had said that afternoon. The recordings Hutchins had provided were, in the agent's assessment, significant. The documentation from Frank's box, authenticated against the library's records and against Frank's own medical timeline, established a chain of custody that Calloway's fabrication claim could not survive. The former bank employee who had cooperated with Doc's investigation had agreed to formal cooperation with federal investigators. Preston Calloway Dock said would be arrested within 72 hours. The two bank officers named in the documentation would be arrested the same day. Judge Patterson had already that afternoon recused himself from every matter related to First Territorial Bank, which was the specific action of a man who has been told clearly that recusal is the least of his available problems. The 7 families, Eleanor said. Doc nodded. Counsel has already been contacted for all 7. The land transfers that occurred through the scheme are legally challengeable. It will take time. Some of the properties have been developed or subdivided in ways that complicate restitution. But the legal framework is there, and there is now a federal investigation with the resources to pursue it. She thought about Norbert Stills in the hardware store in February buying screws for a house that was no longer his. About Doris Pruitt at a kitchen table in a rented house, telling her story in the flat voice of a woman who had told it before and expected it to matter no more this time than it had the others. About Carl Bauer at his window looking out at the river that had been his for 40 years. Make sure they know, she said. Make sure those families know what happened today and what's coming. Doc said they'll know by tomorrow morning. Some of them already know. Word moves. She nodded. Make sure they know it was Frank, she said. Make sure they know a man named Frank Hargrove started this. He didn't finish it. But he started it, and none of the rest of it exists without what he did. Doc looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll make sure. The fire burned high that night, and the smell of food and wood smoke moved through the cool spring air, and the sounds of 500 people who had come to do a thing and done it filled the Hargrove farm from fence line to fence line. Someone had brought instruments. There was a guitar, then 2, then a fiddle, that found its footing slowly and then did not stop. The music was the kind that needs no introduction and no apology, the kind that has been played in fields at night for as long as there have been fields and nights and people with reasons to gather at them. Eleanor stayed on the porch until very late, which was unusual for her because her body's habits were the habits of a farm schedule, and her body was generally very firm about them. But tonight she did not want to go inside. She wanted to stay in the sounds and the light and the particular quality of the night, which had a different character than any other night she had spent on this porch. Brick sat beside her for a while, and they talked about the tractor, about the fuel injectors, about the particular stubbornness of older machines that were worth maintaining. He had grown up on a farm in eastern Oregon, he told her. He had left it at 17 and had not been back. He said this with a matter-of-factness that did not quite conceal what was underneath it. You could come back to one, Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe so, he said. Raymond sat with her again near midnight when the fire had settled and the guitar had stopped, and most of the 500 had found places to sleep in tents arranged in the fields. They sat in a companionable quiet, the two of them, in the way that people sit together when they have been through something and do not need to speak about it to be together inside it. After a while he said, there's something I've been wanting to tell you since January. She said nothing, which was her way of inviting people to continue. He said, the night you told us about Frank. In the barn. I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people, and I have heard a lot of people describe the people they love. And what I've noticed is that most people, when they talk about someone they've lost, they talk about what that person meant to them, what they themselves had because of that person. He paused. You talked about Frank. Just Frank. What he was like. What he thought. What he believed. What made him laugh. You talked about him like he was still a person rather than a possession you'd lost. He looked at her. That's rarer than you'd think. Eleanor looked at the dark fields, at the ember glow of the fire, at the stars that had come out over Montana in their full winter-ending density. He was still a person, she said simply. Yes, Raymond said. He was. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said he would have liked you. Frank. He would have found you difficult and interesting, and he would have argued with you about things, and he would have come around to respecting you, and he would have been annoying about the fact that he'd come around because that was his way. Raymond said, I think I would have liked him too. They sat until the fire went to coals and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the Hargrove farm settled into the deep quiet of a night that has earned its peace. 1 year later, on the first Saturday of April, the first annual Hell's Iron Family Day arrived on the Hargrove farm and the adjacent 10 acres with the cheerful organizational chaos of an event that had been planned carefully and then outgrown its planning. The weather cooperated in the way that April in Montana cooperates when it is in a good mood, bright and cold in the morning, warming to something genuinely pleasant by noon, the sky the specific blue that exists only at altitude and only in that particular month. 1,200 people came. Eleanor had been told to expect 600. She had prepared accordingly, and then she had watched the preparations become insufficient and had adapted the way she adapted to most things by doing more of what she was already doing with whatever additional resources presented themselves. The new clubhouse stood on the Wicker land to the east, a timber and stone building that had taken 6 months to construct, and that was considerably more beautiful than a motorcycle club's operational base had any obligation to be. It had been built by hand by people who came on weekends from across the state, contributing labor the way communities used to contribute labor to buildings that mattered, raising walls together and shingling roofs together, and standing back at the end of a day to look at what the accumulated effort of many people could produce. Brick had overseen the framing. He had also, by the time the building was done, quietly moved to Redemption and opened a garage on the county road, a proper shop with a lift and diagnostic equipment, and he was already the mechanic that people drove 30 miles to see. He had mentioned the farm in eastern Oregon twice in the past year in conversations with Eleanor in a tone that suggested the subject was not closed. Doc's scholarship fund had in its first year sent 11 young people to college. The fund had been capitalized by donations from club members and had then received an unexpected contribution from a Helena attorney who had read about it in one of the newspaper articles generated by the Callaway investigation, which had been extensive. The fund was now formally incorporated. 3 of the 7 families whose land had been part of the Callaway scheme had joined the board. Preston Callaway had been indicted on 23 federal counts, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property rights under color of law. The 2 first territorial officers had accepted plea agreements. Judge Patterson had resigned from the bench and was cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. The trial was set for the following spring. 5 of the 7 families had had their land restored through a combination of federal restitution orders and civil settlement. The remaining 2 cases were in litigation, with outcomes that the attorneys involved described carefully as likely favorable. Norbert Stills had returned to the county. He was renting a house in Redemption while the legal process for the Kellerman property worked its way through the courts, and he attended the family day and shook Eleanor's hand for a long time without saying much, which said everything. Eleanor moved through the day at the pace she had moved through most things in the past year, steadily without hurrying, pausing where pausing was called for and moving on when it was time to move on. She shook hands and told stories and accepted the embraces of people she had known for a year and people she was meeting for the first time. And she ate well, and she laughed more times than she had counted. In the late afternoon, when the crowds had thinned to the people who had come farthest and stayed latest, she found herself on the porch with the original 19. They had gathered there without organizing it, drifting to the porch one by one and 2 by 2 until all of them were present, arranged on the steps and the railings and the rebuilt boards with beers or coffee in the low gold light of the afternoon. They talked the way the original 19 talked when they were together, with the shorthand of people who share a specific history that no one else fully owns, referencing January the way veterans reference a campaign, with a mixture of grimness and dark humor and genuine affection that belongs to people who have been through something together. "You know what I think about?" Brick said at some point in the late afternoon. Several people looked at him. He said, "I think about the version of that night where she doesn't come out, where she looks out the window and she sees the patches and she thinks, 'Not my problem.'" He paused. "That version exists. That version was one decision away from being the version that happened." The porch was quiet. "Because she decided to come out," Doc said. "Because she decided to come out." Brick agreed. One person decided to do one thing, and this is what that looks like 12 months later. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair and looked out at what it looked like. 1,200 people in her fields, a building standing on the land next door that had not existed a year ago, a wheat crop coming in that she had not been sure she would be here to plant. 7 families working their way back to what had been taken from them. A federal case dismantling a system that had been built on the certainty that certain people could be taken from without consequence. And Frank, who had started the thread that pulled all the way out, had unraveled the whole thing. Frank, who had been afraid and had stopped and had been trying to protect her and had kept the box. Frank, who had known where she would find it. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the photograph she had been carrying since January. The one from the wooden box, the one she had carried with her on the morning of April 15th, when she had sat waiting on this same porch. Frank in the field probably 30 years ago, squinting into summer sun, grinning at whoever was behind the camera, which had been her. Grinning at her. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. "You were right," she said softly to the man in the photograph, to the empty chair beside her, to the 41 years of shared mornings that lived in the particular quality of the light over these fields. "You were right about all of it. About choosing who to help. About the box. About leaving it where I'd find it." She paused. "I found it, Frank. I found it, and I used it, and I want you to know what it built. I want you to see this." The elm tree stood in the yard at the edge of her vision, enormous and rooted. Frank had measured it every spring in that small notebook, not because he needed to know how tall it was, but because tending to the growth of a thing is its own form of love. It had grown past measuring, now past the roof line, past the need for anyone to record its progress. It knew what it was. It had always known what it was becoming. The guitar started up again somewhere in the yard, finding the thread of a song that a few voices picked up, and then more spreading across the late afternoon. The way music spreads when the conditions are right, gradually and then completely. Eleanor sat on her rebuilt porch in the April light, with Frank's photograph in her hand, and 1,200 people she had not known a year ago filling the farm that almost was not hers anymore. And she listened to the music move across the land. The wheat came up green in the field. The farm held what it always held, the grief and the grace, the losses and the rescues, the ordinary days and the days that change everything, without comment, without judgment, with the deep and patient permanence of land that has seen everything and endured everything and is still here when the season turns. Eleanor Hargrove was still here too. "You don't get to choose who deserves help," Frank had said. "You just choose whether to help." She had chosen. On a January night in a blizzard with 19 strangers dying in her driveway, and the farm already half lost, and no one watching, and nothing to gain, she had chosen. And this, all of this, the music and the wheat, and the 1,200 people, and the 7 families finding their way home, and the elm tree enormous in the yard, this was what one choice looked like when it was made by the right person at the right moment, and allowed to grow into everything it was capable of becoming. Eleanor Hargrove was still here, and she would be for a long time yet.